Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. We'll get started in about 2 minutes, so just sit back and relax, and we'll be with you in a moment. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Nice to see everyone back again for our penultimate session with the Nonprofit Finance Fund. We've been here for almost 13 weeks, I think, going through some financial management topics. So we're almost here at the end, and we're excited to talk today about the economics of partnerships and collaborations. For those of you that may not know me, my name is Michael Ibrahim, Program Manager with the Culture Investment Portfolio here at the Mass Cultural Council. So we're really excited to be able to present this session for you today. This session is part of our Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts to help organizations come back from COVID-19. Through this entire spring, we've been offering 2 workshops every week. We'll have a total of 43 of them in the areas of financial management, legal issues, human resources, advocacy, management, and board governance. So we're almost here right at the end with our financial management. Joining us today from the Nonprofit Finance Fund are Christine Alvarez and Kaya Scott. We're going to get started in just a moment, but a few ground rules. This session does have automatic captioning. So automatic generated captions are provided on all Mass Cultural Council Zoom meetings and webinars. If you need additional accommodations to ensure your participation, just let us know when you register and we would be happy to do that. If this is distracting for you, there are some options at the bottom of Zoom that you can hide subtitles down there in the closed captioning settings. So feel free to use that however you need to. We will have time for questions and answers throughout this session. Christine and Kaya have made it interactive where you can ask questions in the Q&A and they would be lovely to answer those questions. Another advantage of the Q&A is you can be anonymous if you want to be. So sometimes you don't want to be identified or your organization identified with a question. So feel free to be anonymous if you would like to do that. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Mass Cultural Council's YouTube channel, probably tomorrow. You will get an email from me when that is all ready to be shared and distributed however you feel like you would like to do that. And this session does run for 1 hour, and that includes time for questions and answers. With that, I'd love to turn it over to Christine and Kaya.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael, for having us. It's wonderful to see you again, and just good afternoon to everyone. And just appreciate you all for carving out time today. And Kaya and I are really happy to have the opportunity to spend the next hour with you. We're acknowledging that you're all entering into different spaces of your days, and maybe just coming, straight from another meeting, or helping, with some very kind of like real home at life activities. And so just just grounding us just a bit, before we move us into the learning space. And before we get started, we do want to acknowledge, that we are all also joining from really different places, and want to take a moment to recognize the land that we all reside on, and acknowledging that the land that we live on was stolen from Indigenous community. And so today I join you all from Philadelphia, PA, which is the native home of the Lenni Lenape people. And if you feel comfortable, we will invite you to share in the chat the territory that you're joining from. And if you don't know the territory, you can also click on the link that we're sharing in the chat and look it up. And we'll just allow a moment, for those, who are comfortable to go ahead and share. And in the meantime, I'll just reflect that, NFF is on our own journey to be an anti-racist organization with a primary focus in increasing our work and relationship with Black, Indigenous, and people of color led and serving organizations. So we are, where we can, integrating land acknowledgements where they feel appropriate, and trying to just include voices that were previously excluded. Trying to bravely face the facts of history, no matter how painful. So we also know that the land acknowledgement is just one step and just continues to build and extend our understanding of the world around us. And so just an ongoing invitation, for all of us to learn more about the Native people in each of our respective territories. And so with that, as we move into our core content, I'll invite you all to just share 3 collective breaths together before we move into our session. Okay, great. Thank you all. And so just by way of brief background, I know that a number of you are familiar with Nonprofit Finance Fund. And so just in short, we're a 40-year organization. We've been working with nonprofit and organizational leaders navigate their financial needs through a range of loans and financial consulting. And so in addition to loans, we consult for both nonprofit and grant makers on the use and the deployment of funds in the sector. And wherever possible, we try to step forward, to elevate and lift up for the sector what we're learning about what's working and not working in the field, and advocate for necessary shifts in funding and financing practices so that money flows just with less restriction to community organizations. We, Kaya, and I, and the team at NFF, we certainly have experience and a perspective to share, and we have a lot of experience in this virtual room. And so we'll ask that you contribute to the learning experience today. So this is just an invitation that if you have a response to something, please feel free to put it into the chat, or into the Q&A. If you have a question, certainly put it into the Q&A, and I'll try not to lose track of it. And we'll kind of lean on Kaya and Michael, if I'm just missing it. And so we're all just here as peers. And so, with that, just a reminder as well that, that we've been stuck in these little Zoom boxes, for the better part of a year. And so certainly invite you to also just take a break, a stretch, do whatever you need to take care of yourself. And so just to put today's session in context, we are, let me just making sure I'm maybe just stuck just a moment, that some of you may be dropping in for the first time today, and others have been on the longer journey with us for the past couple of months. So for those of you who have been with us, the last couple of weeks, our team has been discussing various concepts on managing different types of risk and opportunity. And if you were on the line with us last week, you heard from our colleague Ashley Franks about how to communicate the full cost of delivering on mission as one strategy for managing through this period. And so today we're just going to delve into another business decision, an area that offers both opportunity and risk on the area of collaboration and partnership. And so today's goals are organized around just how we unpack the area of collaborations and partnerships from the standpoint of what are the key considerations if you and your organization are pursuing or exploring potential collaboration opportunities. And so the learning goals are really about 3 key categories. So the first is just recognizing the factors for successful collaboration. The second is about assessing partnership prospects and facilitating productive conversations with potential partners. And then lastly, identifying the financial considerations and risks, including full costs and partnerships and collaboration. And in just a moment, we'll launch a poll to just gauge where some of you may be in this exploration already. And so if you could just take a moment, our question is really just, helping us level set, and just hearing, from all of you in the room in terms of where are you in your exploration of partnerships and collaboration today. So just give a few minutes. Okay. So Michael, I think we can go ahead and close the poll with that critical mass. And so, yeah, we certainly have a range of, of starting points, with about a third of you in the early stages of exploring potential partnership. The better part, of the group, close to 60%, you're actively engaged in assessing potential partnership and collaboration. And then just a couple of you who are already engaged in partnership and collaboration. So that is really helpful context, just as we move into the content today. So thank you for just helping us get grounded in terms of where we're all starting from. And so, starting from the beginning, I think that, one of the first things that we try to unpack is just the term of collaboration. It is broad, and it is helpful for, I think, for this conversation just to recognize the broad spectrum of how organizations partner and collaborate. For those who are in the process of exploring, you may be trying to understand, what place on the spectrum may be the best fit, or ideal fit for you. And the term collaboration, frankly, gets bandied, about quite a bit and wrapped up, in a whole lot of, other terms, and can have a variety of meanings depending on who you're talking to. And so when we're using the term collaboration or partnerships for the purposes of today's discussion, we're really thinking about the activities that change the nature of how organizations interact, insofar as how they integrate in some way with one another. And so you can think of collaboration, at least on this spectrum, one that varies by the degrees of integration. So the left-hand side of this visual, we have less integration, and on the right, more degrees of integration. So the more you move from left to right, you are talking about those more formal, opportunities for sharing information, coordinating. The more you move to the left, that's where you're talking about activities that have more to do about less formal coordination. So one example may be, where you're referring clients, and or scheduling events like opportunistically, the type of things that don't require like formality in how you're sharing information or coordinating programs. So there's certainly some level of relationship there, but it's not particularly formal, and certainly does not require any integration between the partners. So the relationships are important, but they're not as much of the focus for today. And so when we're really talking about collaboration partnerships, we're typically referring to those activities that involve, some level of systematic coordination. Let me just or alignment in the work, so that the outcomes, are coordinated together for some greater impact. Within this collaboration box, we're also typically dealing with a longer term relationship that involves shared mission, goals, decision making. And a few examples of collaboration form across the integration spectrum include things like shared revenue or expense, joint programming. Sometimes it's operational ventures or a parent subsidiary type of relationship, or full merger or acquisition. And I'm just going to just check because I can't quite see the Q&A box, but I thought I said yes. Just let me know, Michael or Kaya, if I thought I saw a prompt. Okay, thank you. And just bear in mind that the things that are on this slide, these aren't the only structural options. Depending on the goals of the partner organizations and the terms that are agreed to by the partners, virtually any structural option can be possible. I think just one note that we wanted to make on I think we get the question, like what is the difference between collaboration and partnership? And they both really exist within this category of longer term relationship of mutual goals, decision making. But the distinction is often it's often within whether or not there is a formal contractual relationship involving just close cooperation between the two or more parties, and that contract really specifies what are the joint rights, what are the responsibilities, laying out like the risk in some cases. So that's partnership, where there is the existence of a formal contract, whereas collaboration, it more broadly involves cooperation in which the parties are not necessarily bound contractually. And so so just wanted to make that one like subtle distinction there. And before determining structure, even the first step really is about like just getting clear about your goals first. So what is the function that you seek? And I'm actually going to like move us forward just to this, because I think like on that latter slide, it raises, some of the similar points, and that I think most times when we work with organizations in our advisory practice, one of the first places that they typically go to is about what's the right structure and form, where really the first important step is getting clear on the goals of partnership, which may seem, like a very basic and obvious point, but I do think it's one that often gets missed. There's, sort of like a fun mantra, a fun fact, from the architectural world, just an architect, Louis Sullivan, that had coined the phrase form follows function, which really just means that and became a touchstone for many architects, that really had to do with leading with purpose. So the purpose of a building being the starting point before any kind of design. And I think that phrase is really relevant, for today's discussion about partnerships and collaborations. Again, sort of just making the point that form should follow function, not the other way around. And so only after getting that clarity, can we then begin to explore which structure or form may be helpful to consider. And so let's talk a little bit about, just like that number one, piece about getting clear about goals. There are all sorts of reasons, for why nonprofits collaborate. And I would just be curious, as I'm kind of like walking through this, for those who are currently in the process of exploring, I would invite you, to enter into the chat. What are some of the things that are coming up for you in terms of your reasons or purpose for collaborating. And so, I'll just kind of, keep an eye, on any kind of like comments as I run through these three sections. The first, typically is that there's oftentimes just the motivation for achieving some economies of scale. The idea that there can be potential cost savings if organizations can jointly purchase or have shared use of transportation or other shared expenses. Some cases it's about facility rental, or creating some sort of like consolidated preferred vendor program, or joint staff training. And frequently these shared activities, they are motivated primarily by savings. Another reason may have to do with just being able to expand reach and impact, so advancing the mission through perhaps a more wider, efficient, outreach or referrals process, that partnering organizations can provide each other a steady flow of clients, relieving program staff of just kind of like the I don't want to say burden, but certainly like the all that comes with client recruitment. And strong collaboration in the area can also result in a more holistic approach to clients as well. Expanding offerings and services without necessarily increasing the budget, is sort of, like kind of like that connection between the first and two, the first and second categories here. Yeah, and thank you, Kate. Just lifting up just the goal around broadening awareness and reach. That very much gets into this second area. And then the third area is really about mitigating against risk. And so just, trying to share the risk with a partner, any kind of risk that may be, inherent with innovation or experimentation that looks and feels differently when it can be shared, with a collaborating entity. And it could also just be a potential risk mitigation strategy. So in addition to kind of financial resources, sort of like sharing, whether that's like brand, kind of like social capital. And so there are, I think, just like a range of reasons. I'm sure that there are ones, that don't exist on this page. I would be curious if there are things that you all find are missing from this list. And I think that these capture kind of like the three broader reasons, but certainly invite you all, anyone who's seeing or has identified something that is missing here. And we'll move on momentarily to just talk about, like once we get clear on the goals and purpose and function, how do we then move to quantify the value of a collaboration, and then assess and articulate the strength that and the value that we bring to a particular partnership, before we then look to partners. Okay, and so we're just going to take a moment to talk about like following like just like that that initial process of getting clear, then moving into a space of just making the case and making the case not to just the potential partner, but also to ourselves. When we think about what is the value proposition, for us entering into this kind of partnership structure. And I think that, for us, we've seen many examples of where organizations have actually come together to develop the value proposition collaboratively. And so we just offer a few questions, that may be helpful, and just walk it through here. The first, that's really just, just like identifying that problem, the compelling problem, to the partner in terms of just what is the problem that you as an organization are looking to address. What are the motivations, and how could partnership, help address that particular problem or challenge? And why is it important? Why does it matters? Why does it matter? And then how your organization provides a solution, and what kind of outcome is really being sought after. And so what outcomes does your organization produce? What are the target goals? What services do you expect to deliver to achieve the outcomes? And then what pre-existing relationship may already exist, with the organization. And then the third is really about really stating your distinctive, your unique distinction, why your organization is better than alternative options. And so how does your organization deliver the results in a way that is more ideal or better, than other peer alternatives? And what are the unique strengths that you bring to the table? And then lastly, being transparent about just like what is the support that your organization would need in terms of gaps in capacity, or learning edges. And so what capacities would we need to acquire or expand on? And how might they be actually bolstered, or complemented, through this partnership? And what other kind of corresponding resource needs, would there be? And so this is certainly not an exhaustive list of questions, but I think, a good starting point, these kind of like big, broader questions to help narrow down how we go about really focusing, our attention in terms of kind of approach. I think we can get into some of the details in actually a framework that we introduced in our first session, and have sort of attempted to weave, or you may have seen this show up in some of our subsequent sessions. This core framework, or the complete strengths framework that we offer, sort of like a deeper dive, it can actually be a really helpful resource in assessing not just kind of like our own self-inventory of skills and capacities for our organization, but also really uncovering where you would benefit from partnership with others, or what are the gaps we would need to be aware of when entering into partnerships. So I'm just going to go briefly through each component, but would also emphasize that we at NFF, we most frequently work with the numbers part and are perhaps the most comfortable in finance, but we certainly don't think about finance in isolation. And so that is especially true when thinking about your organization's strengths and gaps in relation to collaboration. And so these pieces all fit together and are necessary for collaboration mission success. I think I just want to, do just a gut check to see if there. I don't see any questions in the chat, or in the comments, and so just, certainly just, feel free to raise your hand, or enter into any questions as they're coming up for you. And so just drilling down briefly into those 4 core areas of the strengths framework, we often think of people and skills as one core area, that captures the knowledge, abilities of our staff, management, leadership to deliver on mission, not just now, but in the future. And so there are a few, things that you've heard us, describe, over the past several weeks, in terms of just what does that look like? It looks like, leadership with strong, analytics, kind of like a strategic, mindset, kind of like core subject matter expertise, within our program teams, certainly resources to recruit, retain, and train staff, and then communication across the team. And so in terms of like partnership, some questions that are helpful in this regard, would be like what are the sort of organizational cultural dynamics and components that would be important, as you're entering into any kind of relationship, or partnership. Are there any, would you need additional staff or new expertise? So within kind of like the people and skills, that kind of, like question, not just on expertise and culture, skills and expertise, but also just sort of like alignment, in terms of like who our organization is, would be a couple of, items to consider. Another slice of that framework has to do with kind of like the intellectual, like the data and the know-how, like how do we know that we're delivering on our mission in the way that we say or set out to do? And, what is the quality of the data that we collect? How do we use it? And so again, just like in the self-reflection, a lot of those questions, in terms of data and know-how have to do with, do we have people and skills and systems that allow us, to really collect the sort of like the results, the inputs, understand, kind of like impact. And then in entering partnership, a couple of questions that that could be helpful is to just understand like what is the goal in terms of impact and reach. How would that change? With any particular partner, and how could a partner add value to programs and services? On the financial, so we spent, certainly a lot of time, within this realm, in terms of really unpacking not just balance sheet strength and, how does the budget look, but really getting to how well can we, how well do we understand our full costs of our mission delivery, and how well, does our staff and team leadership, have the understanding, to really match mission to money? What kind of systems, are available, to track and analyze the funding and the relationships and funding that get to resources? And so again, I think on the partnership, a couple of questions that are helpful to consider are just, just like what would be the impact, in terms of financial resources, and the kind of consequences, that that may affect the organization, kind of like post partnership. And staying within the financial realm, I think we wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking about like just what are the total kind of like full costs, when entering into a collaboration. And so we really think about it in terms of capturing both those one-time startup costs as well as the ongoing costs that are associated with the work. And it can be really useful to divide these costs into two categories on the budget. A few weeks back, and we had a session about strategic budgeting that offered some templates, that just to provide some ideas, for how do you capture both those one-time and ongoing expenses, because the funding to pay for these types of costs can be and look really different. So there are things like when you're building a collaboration, some examples of that one-time upfront expense that could look like those technology investments and upgrades, capital investments, if there are any kind of like consultants that are needed to help either gauge the feasibility, and or help with kind of like stakeholder kind of like grounding or board development. And then there's also additional ongoing annual expenses that oftentimes can take the form of new staff or program supplies, but they can really show up in those if our impact is going to look differently or we're going to track it differently, how does it affect the budget? And if our need for resources looks different, how does that fundraising capacity, how does that shift and affect the bottom line? And so this is, again, just sort of like a broader view of just kind of like the categories. We'll come back to some of these costs, later when we touch on just some of the barriers of collaboration. But just wanted to highlight these up front because there is a need to kind of identify the financial costs. We've offered just a way of you can see kind of like those questions, for reflection. There's kind of like an easy way to turn that into a template. So we'll just offer this, as part of the PowerPoint that's in the Dropbox. Similar, to many of the questions that that we just walked through. That we would just encourage you, just to think about like all four quadrants, as you're assessing or considering any type of partnership opportunity. And I do see a question in the chat, from John. And his question is: are you aware of any special grant funding for upfront costs? And so, I will certainly, invite Kaya to weigh in here as well. But I can't say that I've seen, sort of like a regular or consistent source of special grant funding. I think where I have seen it shown up has been in individual, like philanthropic initiatives. And so I think that there are certainly places, where foundations have offered, depending on, kind of like the current strategic initiative, or goals and objectives, may have, funds, or an initiative that's designated specifically for those who are testing the feasibility of collaboration. But that really varies by market, or at least from what I have seen. I'm going to see, Kaya and Michael, I'm not aware of any kind of, ongoing, kind of like resource as it relates to those kind of upfront costs. But let me know if you're aware.
I'm not aware of any, but just would offer that as you're thinking organizationally about collaborating, building it in as a strategic priority into your budget would be really wise. So as you're thinking about your budget for the fiscal year, if partnership and collaboration is something that you're hoping to explore, if those numbers, so whatever it's going to cost for that to be the case, makes it into your budget and you can anticipate the revenue necessary to meet those expenses, then you're showing a funder that it's a strategic priority for your organization and to advance your mission. Then you can advocate differently for what it is that you need in order to pilot that opportunity or pilot the partnership and the impact that could come for your organization and for the community that you're hoping to serve. So I would always often start there because I think your budget really is the first step in how a funder or a donor gets to see what you value.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a really great point. And I'll also just add, do a little mini plug for next week's session, because I think that Michael Cass's session on financial storytelling in a way, pulls all of the pieces, kind of like the technical pieces that we've been reviewing and discussing over the past several weeks. How do you really bring that to life? And, whether that's in a written narrative or in the budget template itself. And so, so that would be the only additional thing that I would add to Kaya's comment. And I see, Michael's, also referencing the full cost content that we discussed in last week's session, where yes, Ashley kind of, walked us through kind of like a similar kind of like template, to really get at that. Okay. And so I think on that note, and just, building, from the question here, is that I think that, much of what we were just referencing, about like how do you communicate like that upfront costs? I mean, certainly it's connected, right? To all of these other assessment areas, of like if we know, that there's going to be a different way, for example, that we're going to have to staff, recruit people, sort of like think about like our relationships, in community, and then track and show data, that all those pieces are connected. And so just getting, like doing that assessment, I think I'm just affirming that there's value, in that walkthrough of all those questions, so that you are in the best position, to really build the most robust and rigorous budget. This looks like a really scary slide because there's a lot going on here. But this was just, meant to take that blank worksheet and just show an example. We don't have to, we won't walk, through all of these, but just to make the point that, there can be very kind of like high level reflections. And so this particular, organization, that I had worked with, they were really trying to understand, kind of like strengths and gaps and what it would look like, in their conversations with potential partners. And so, for example, in the kind of like data and know-how, kind of spectrum, they wanted to, they really thought that they could offer like a strong continuum of services and tools, systems, and skills to measure and track results that have a track record to be effective. And what they were really seeking was a partner, that had a commitment to youth issues. So there was kind of like a mission alignment and kind of like strategic, alignment. So that's just, kind of like one example, of like how they started to move around this sheet, so that they could just have, all of these pieces in one place. Certainly, it was a reference, for how they, that they came back to and iterated on the budget. And so, so we just offer it here as an example, just to say that, in whatever level of detail, it just gives a glimpse, of how the framework could help to uncover strengths and gaps when assessing, a strong collaboration, or partner. And so we do want to kind of go back, and I'll pause here just to see if there are, I don't seeing no questions in the chat. This is included in the PowerPoint deck, along with the blank, worksheet. We want to move into just some of the kind of like the risks, and barriers, not to say that we want to focus on, what's challenging, but really just to bring them up front, and just, and just kind of call them out, as the barriers, that we've seen in partnerships, that can either, kind of like hinder a collaboration from either starting or getting off the ground, or, just slowing down their ability, to achieve the intended goals. And so this is not an exhaustive list, but I think that we typically see many challenges fall into these four realms. It's either kind of like knowledge, or like not, fully understanding the process and potential pitfalls. The second, really about trust and partnerships. not having resources, that are sufficient to see the partnership all the way through. And then certainly risk, many times, they are financial in nature, of just entering into the unknown. And so just going to take a couple of moments to touch on these areas. So we have, both kind of like the barrier of knowledge, and broken down just what we tend to see in terms of like what the challenge looks like, and then just some suggestions on how to approach, and in some ways knowledge, it can actually be one of the relatively easier barriers to navigate. And I say that just relative to some of the other ones that are on the list, because while each partnership is unique, it's got its own set of partners and goals and personalities and other circumstances that, partnerships and collaborations, have certainly been done before. And so though it can seem fragmented, there are resources and experts that are available, to help support and plan and help to implement. But some of the most fundamental challenges that I think we see many leaders face, is that they look relatively simple here, but they can be quite nuanced, just in terms of just addressing that barrier of not knowing what it would look like, or having like the uncertainty around just not knowing what we don't know, and so I think that just where there is not like a track record as well with a potential partner, there's certainly sort of like just an area of of kind of like history, sort of like track record, and then just not having a clear understanding of the structure that we were talking about earlier. And so some of these fall into legal, some of them fall into kind of like partnership, kind of like track record, but certainly all of them fall into just not having sort of like a flow of information. So a lot of the things that are on the right hand side have to do with just like facilitating just those kind of open and candid planning processes, really looking at an organization's existing track record, inventory of knowledge, people, skills, and then really looking at how collaboration is trending in a particular sector. In some cases, it's helpful to know how it's tracking within a particular market, and there are resources that that are meant for, and dedicated, to help, not just test feasibility, to really help with, kind of like post, formal agreement, kind of implementation. I think one example, that I mean, there are many, to point to, but I think oftentimes we see sort of like the knowledge gap, occur within data. And so who will have access to data? How will it be shared or merged? And oftentimes, the gaps in data, it can require an agreement, on how data points will be shared, used, interpreted, whether that agreement is formal or informal. That some of the questions that that often need to be answered is, really about like what kind of internal performance management and and funding metrics do we need to have in hand? How are we defining success? Are there indicators that will help us determine or help us keep on track? And if there are data points that are required for compliance purposes, we'll want to know like, and this is often attached to like a funding source, public sources, like processing or requiring certain types of invoices or for reimbursements. And so really thinking through like what are all of the systems that are behind all of these questions, is a much longer term kind of process. And then again, like this last piece is really about like that financial dynamic in terms of investments that may be required upfront or ongoing, and how might we be able to kind of like track the management of revenue. And Kate is asking a question just about, is there a recording to last week's presentation? And last week's presentation, as well as all subsequent, are available on the MCC website. And so we'll see about just kind of getting you, Kate, just a link to those recordings. The next challenge that we typically see is really about trust. And I think that this is one of the more difficult potential barriers to overcome, because it certainly speaks more to our individual selves, like mistrust, it is often fueled by just a fear of uncertainty or change, or kind of like a loss of control. And so all of those are somewhat just inherent in moving in the direction of some form of collaboration. And so I think I think what's underneath all of these, and I see it like on the second bullet point, is just, also speaking to the challenge of cultural differences between organizations. That oftentimes collaboration can shift the overall culture of how an organization, how the team interacts. Okay, yeah, and thank you, Michael. And so just in terms of, on the right-hand side, some things that have helped, that we've seen support, and nothing's ever perfect. I actually heard someone recently say that, collaboration really gets driven not by organizations, but by individuals. And I think that that's, absolutely true, in terms of like, how you think about building relationship, and advancing relationships, especially, within a partnership context. But I think just an initial awareness of an organization's work, the people on their staff and the boards, and how we build relationship, all of that, is a factor of time, and showing up, and showing up often. And so just moving down the path, towards collaboration, those connection points. And it sounds, like such a basic and obvious, item. And I think that we see on this side that it is one of the more difficult, topics and barriers, because there is a need, for that alignment among partners, and where there are gaps, having to navigate difficult conversations early on, becomes harder, as the process, evolves. And so certainly, I think one thing, among the things that are on here is just the importance of writing the commitments down. That's the fourth one down, on the right-hand side. Just, whether that's in a memorandum of understanding or a collaboration agreement document, that's not a, not a legal document, but just something that, articulates what we are expecting, from each other in relationship, so that you're not, having to rely on a handshake and can kind of avoid, some common, misunderstandings that can happen up front. And on the last, and this really gets to just the financial barriers, just that have to do with resources. I talked a little bit about kind of like the time that is needed for building trust and relationship, and exploring, planning, because certainly collaborations don't happen overnight. And so I think that we see a lot of executive directors who are in the middle of their own collaboration processes, and will often reflect, just how that really feels and really needs the space of almost a second job, or duty, on top of what they're running. So I think that's just a consideration, just as, anyone who's like entering into the process. And then I think on the financial resources, we talked a little bit about some of the real costs of pursuing collaboration, consultants, technology, kind of a marketing rebranding, is just some examples. But because of the added costs of pursuing collaboration, cost savings, they can be difficult to realize in the short term. That those gains might be offset, by expenses of getting the collaboration up and running. And then lastly, I think just a note, that there's not always, to the question, that was raised earlier about like access to resources for these kind of upfront investments, that there's not necessarily like incentive, to collaborate in the field, and that, and the resource or having access, to resources is just one example. I think that in the case of, many, funding agencies, there's, sort of like a mantra, or sort of like a goal around collaboration, but not necessarily clarity about how, like organizations that are coming together, what might be the impact in terms of overall funding reduction, or grant making, and so to the extent that these challenges are are manageable, there's a few things, to consider. I'll just touch on a couple that, if we are collaborating for mission first, that it at least ensures that if we take a longer time than planned to generate cost savings, that we are still, being true to kind of like delivering, on mission success. I think another, piece, that we hear is just like designating a task force of staff, of key staff and board, and for those on that task force to really plan for significant time investment. I think a couple of other things, here, is just about, to the question that was asked earlier, just seeking funding for that one-time costs and determining the business model for ongoing expenses. I think what's wrapped up like in that, like, how do I tell that story, has a lot to do with, how we really dig into the financial kind of questions, so that we understand not just the impact, to our organization, but what are the resource considerations. How is each organization contributing parts of their own capital? Are there existing resources that can be utilized? What's required? What are the current resources? Are there things that can be blended? So there are a number of just kind of considerations that ought to be included, as we're building that budget, for sharing or making that case for support in terms of why, pursue, or look at this collaboration now, and what could be the potential benefit, but then really kind of getting out in front of how we see this particular financial impact and the potential barrier of risk. And so you've heard us say, over the last several weeks, that it's really organizations that have the space, in their balance sheet, if there are resources that allow us to adapt and bounce back, or just have, sort of space in times of an opportunity like collaboration, or other kind of, one-time events, that those, are those that are most most supported in terms of managing through the challenges that are associated with both assessing as well as implementing a partnership or collaboration. And if nothing else, it's just that, collaborating, it typically means that we're innovating on approaches. And so we're setting, sort of like a high bar for success that may be higher, than where we would typically set it. And so there is likely to be risk. And so a lot of the themes, from our previous sessions about, that these are some of the characteristics, that we would just want to keep an eye out for, that if we're seeing, some of these, kind of like, little, sort of like room and cash on the balance sheet, it's not, that we can't pursue, but that we should just, think about like the timing, in terms of when we take on the risk of forging partnerships, or at what pace. Okay. And so I know that we want to certainly point you, to the next session that, that attempts to kind of pull all the various pieces of financial strength and considerations, into that larger question, of how do we tell our financial story, in the most wholesome and impactful way. and I think like on this subject of collaboration, knowing that we kind of walk through a lot of the different kind of like questions, for consideration, the barriers, just to be, really explicit about, like the common, either challenges, roadblocks, all that to say that entering into partnership is certainly not easy, and it certainly doesn't happen overnight. And our funding system, may not always be in place to optimally support those efforts. And yet, because the impact benefits, can be significant. I think that it's just, this session is really attempted just to marry the kind of like non-financial and financial questions that can help inform conversations internally with your team, as well as with a prospective partner, so that, we can kind of get, really explicit and articulate the full costs, of entering into not just our work, but in special, initiatives and times, where we are, really pursuing something new that has been untested. That's where I think like the concepts of full costs, telling the financial story, certainly, comes into play. And so I don't see any additional questions in the chat. Kaya, I'd offer, if there's anything that you wanted to offer, or questions, that were coming up for you, or anything that I missed, in the chat, I would offer you space here before we turn back to Michael.
No, I think you did a great job covering everything, and just encourage everyone to consider partnership when it makes sense and not feel the pressure to always have to collaborate to get things done, as I think funders are shifting in and changing in their concepts and perspectives around collaboration. So just for organizations to trust their process and trust what's necessary and come up with their own criteria, using some of the points that you've mentioned today to evaluate that. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Christine and Kaya. Really appreciate your expertise and actually starting this conversation with us on partnerships and collaboration, because this Thursday we have Molly Penn from Penn Creative actually helping us understand what are the essential ingredients of a good partnership and how you build collaboration. And so I'm going to put that in the chat here. That's where we get to the human side of how all of this works and what's the steps and the memorandum of understanding and agreements and all the stuff that you might want to do in order to make sure that your partnership and collaborations actually turned out to be fruitful. So if you want to continue this conversation where we kind of focused on some of the financial elements of that today, come on Thursday. And then I also chatted here, this is our final session with Nonprofit Finance Fund. So Michael started us out, I believe, back in March 30th. End of March, and is going to wrap us up here. And so, yeah, I think that date may be different, April 22nd. No, it's probably going to be June. That's okay. It is next Tuesday. I can confirm for everybody, same time, same channel. And so we'll be wrapping that out. And then our final two in this whole series is all about advocacy. So Emily Ruddick and her team from Mass Creative are going to be with us to talk about, as we continue that conversation, how you communicate your case for support, both how to strategize, how to organize, and how you can be efficient at advocacy, both at the state level and also at the federal level. So those are our final two sessions. I put in the link to our Recover, Rebuild, and Renew blog, so you can find those two links in addition to the last two that we have coming up, and you can register with those too. Our recordings are all available on that site. So if you want to go back and watch a recording pretty much from any of the sessions that we have, feel free. You can get them on the YouTube channel as well. Christine and Kaya, thank you so much for your expertise and your knowledge today. And for everybody else, thanks for joining at 1 o'clock here on a Tuesday. We'll let you go. Stay safe, and we'll see you at the next workshop. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.